Thank you for joining us tonight. We will get underway in a few moments. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. We will start the briefing at 6 p.m. Thank you for joining tonight. We'll get underway in just a moment. Thank you for joining us. We are here tonight to answer some of your questions about how Canada's drug review and reimbursement system works and what that means for access to Trikafta and other disease modulators. This briefing is part of a series on access to modulators that we are running to provide needed information to the Canadian cystic fibrosis community about CF modulators, including Trikafta, and their pathway into the hands of Canadians who need them. Recordings of past webinars can be found on our websites. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the donors who make these briefings and our other government relations efforts possible. I'm Kim Steele, Director of Government and Community Relations for Cystic Fibrosis Canada. Joining me today is Dr. Supriya Sharma, Chief Medical Advisor, Health Canada, William Bill Dempster, Chief Executive Officer, 360 Public Affairs, and Joanne Chambers, President of 360. Dr. Sharma, Bill, and Joanne, thank you for joining us this evening. We are over the moon to have such a learned and inspirational panel. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We have received a number of questions in advance of today's session, many of which will be addressed in Dr. Sharma and 360 Public Affairs presentations. These presentations will make up the first half of tonight's webinars. The remaining time will be dedicated to your questions. During the Q&A portion of the webinar, I will read your questions and our panel will respond. If you wish to ask a question, please use the chat box. Due to the number of questions received, we may not be able to answer all of your questions live. We will provide a written summary of all questions asked prior to and during today's session in our blog, and we will provide a link to the blog on social media, as well as a link to a recording of this session. And with that, Dr. Sharma, over to you for an overview of what the Health Canada review is, which potential pathways Trikafta may take, and how long a review may take.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I'm just going to share my screen. She says that she doesn't quite get this right yet. Hold on. I need someone to be able to allow me to do a share screen.
You should be able to now.
Awesome. All right. So, oh, those are my emails. Okay. Sorry. Oh, dear. It's been a busy week. There we go. Okay, there we go. So thanks very much, Kim, and for all the folks at CF Canada for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. This really came up from a meeting we had around access to medications and modulators specifically, and a bit of an explanation around how the regulatory system works and how it gets integrated into the rest of the health system. So we thought it would be a good idea to kind of do, it's a little bit of drug regulation 101. And it'll feel a little bit like a university kind of presentation, but I promise that it will actually be really relevant in terms of all of the questions and potentially some advice on advocacy and how to work through the system. I see that there's somebody got a hand raised. But just before I go any further, just want to make sure that there's no difficulties in terms of the sound or visuals. Is everything okay?
We're good. We're good, Dr. Sharma.
Awesome. So I'll go through a little bit of this and then we'll open it up for questions. And the presentation is really focused around, obviously, the most important thing around patient access to needed medications. We'll talk a little bit about pre-market regulations of drugs, what happens before they get the authorization, and then what happens after. So, I mean, this goes without saying to this group, of course, but it's important for us. The reason that we're here as a regulatory system is to make sure that people actually have access to the medications that they need. And Health Canada serves a bit of a gateway to health protection to make sure that those medications meet the regulations and meet the standards for safety, efficacy, and quality before they're allowed to be marketed in Canada. And the way the system works is that there's actually a prohibition to sell a drug in Canada unless it has some sort of Health Canada authorization. And I'll go through, as we go through the presentation, you know, how those might be a little bit different, but really that's the role of Health Canada, is to allow that. And then of course, there's obviously access parameters in the rest of the system. So here we have kind of Health Canada as the regulator, CADTH and INESSS as the health technology assessors, giving recommendations around reimbursement. Obviously, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance that does negotiations on the pricing side, and then the federal, provincial, territorial ministries of health that really make the decisions about which drugs they will fund. Of course, we have private insurers in there as well. And beside that is the Patent and Medicines Price Review Board that sets the price ceilings for medications, new medications in Canada. So the Health Canada role in health products and food branch is really focused. I think people often think about the pre-market review of drugs. We'll start with that. And just to give you an idea of where we sit in Health Canada, so the health products and food branch is one of the branches, and that's the primary branch that does regulation of medications, medical devices, biologics, including vaccines, veterinary drugs, natural health products, non-prescription drugs, and food to a certain extent. And then we have the regulatory operations and enforcement branch. And that's the group that looks at making sure that all of the sites that manufacture these products are up to standards, does all the inspections, and if there are breaches in terms of compliance and enforcement with the regulations, they're the police arm of Health Canada. And then here's a little bit of the structure in Health Products and Food Branch. My position actually sits at the level of the department. So I'm the Chief Medical Advisor to the Deputy Minister, but I also have a role as a Senior Medical Advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister in this branch. And you can see we've got the various different directorates there. And the three that I just wanted to point out are the Therapeutic Products Directorate. So that's the group that's responsible for pharmaceuticals, including generic drugs. The Biologic and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate. So again, the biologic, a lot of the modifiers, modulators, vaccines, blood products. And then we have the Natural Health Products and the Non-Prescription Health Products Directorate. And then other groups that do post-market surveillance. We have the Medical Device Directorate as well, and a host of other organizations within the branch. Oh, they've been buildings in. So this is just a little bit of just kind of a slide to tell you the numbers that we're dealing with in terms of the numbers of drugs that are marketed in Canada. Obviously the human drugs and the pharmaceutical side, biologics, veterinary drugs, disinfectants, and then the radiopharmaceuticals. And this is the legislative and regulatory framework. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that knowing where we're grounding our decisions. So whether it's at the level of the act or regulations or guidelines or policies. So knowing where access issues might be arising or where you want to put some emphasis on policy change, it's really helpful to know where those sticking points might be or where those levers are. Because as you go up this pyramid, it's more time consuming and it's a more labor intensive act to make changes, and it involves different parts of the government as well. So when we look at what part of the act or regulations, the guidelines, the policy we're going to be influencing, it's called instrument of choice. So what things do we need to modify to achieve the objective, the policy objective that we want? If we can do it in policy, because that's something that's relatively easy to change, we'll do that. If it needs to have more weight in terms of a legal basis, it might be in guidelines or more likely in regulations. And there's a whole parliamentary process that needs to go into place and a consultation that needs to go into place. And then we have the level of the act, which again is a large scale change and at the highest level in the legal side of things. The other thing is that with respect to any changes that start to affect things like the Food and Drugs Act, is that because it's often something that doesn't happen very often, when we start to open up the Food and Drugs Act, if we are making changes, we do get a lot of organizations that have their list of asks, and they want to try to make sure that that's included in any revisions. So that's also, it adds to the complexity a little bit as well. This is just a little graphic that kind of talks about the fact that the Health Canada, the regulator, is not something that's just a point in time. In fact, with respect to medications, it's something that we start with the overview and the oversight of clinical trials when drugs are in development. It continues through some of the special access program, access mechanisms, of course, for the review of medications and biologics. Then it continues as well through that phase when the products are being used out in the healthcare systems, make sure that they're continuing to be monitored, and that there is anything that we need to intervene on, we have some authorities to be able to do that. I wanted to talk just a little bit in terms of exceptional pathways to drug access. So this is in a case where a product is not authorized in Canada, but there's still a medical need for it. And that can be in various different phases of a product. But in general, we would say that if a medication is in early development, that the best way to access that medication is through a clinical trial. It's still experimental in those cases, and we've authorized clinical trials for as few as one person. And the reason that we also do that is because it gives some protections to the people that are part of those trials. So it protects the participants, there's requirements on ethics, there's requirements on retention of documents. But there are circumstances where people need access to medications that aren't otherwise authorized in Canada, and perhaps they are authorized in other countries, or they are past a certain level of development, but so far the company hasn't sought regulatory approval in Canada. So we do have the special access program. And this is a program for individuals. So an individual physician will make a request for an individual patient and basically is saying that there are no other options available in Canada. So the ones that are there are either unsuitable, or there are no options that are available, or they're options that have been tried and failed. And the interesting thing about the special access program is that it is an exceptional release program. So if you get an authorized product with the special access program, it takes you out of all the protections of the regulations and the Food and Drugs Act, because it's really for emergency or life-threatening illnesses and on a case-by-case basis. So it's not a preferred way to access a medication, but it is an important mechanism for people who need medications that may not otherwise be available. And we have made provisions for something called urgent public health need. So if there is a public health need overall in a jurisdiction, in a province or a territory, for example, there is a mechanism to bring in products that are not authorized in Canada, but are authorized for sale in the US or in Europe or in Switzerland, but may not be available in Canada yet. And in that case, the public health officer for the province or territory makes a declaration that this product is needed, and what it's needed for. As long as it's needed for the same purpose that it's being authorized in another country, and a quantity can be brought in without having full Health Canada authorization. And we've done that with respect to dealing with the opioid crisis in some places, with some large-scale public health needs around tuberculosis treatments that weren't otherwise unavailable. And so that list is actually on the website. You can access that, and those authorizations are active for a year, and they can be renewed if need be. So the part of this is that people are most familiar with, or at least in terms of the concept, is this market authorization or usual drug authorization. And that's where a company will put together all the information related to a medication, so the laboratory data, the animal studies, all the clinical trial data from humans, as well as the manufacturing information, put that in a submission and bring it to Canada to seek market authorization. And a standard review timeline is 300 calendar days. And people often ask, well, why would take so long? And we've done an estimate on some of the new drug submissions, and it's the equivalent, a lot of the biologic ones especially, are the equivalent of about 1,200 3-inch ring binders full of information. So that gets poured through. There's a verification process that our reviewers do. The different parts of the submission are packaged and given to different groups with different parts of the expertise, and then the integration piece comes together before they make a final decision. And there are pathways to get basically have access to a shorter review time to expedite that review. And one is a priority review policy. And so that shortens the overall review time from 300 calendar days to 180 calendar days. And that's the new deadline. Now, a review can take shorter than that, or shorter than the 300, shorter than the 180 days, depending on what the deadline is. It really depends on the information in the review and the reviewer is going through and whether or not there are questions. And if you have to go back to the company to get additional information. So it really depends on the actual content of the review. There's also provision to do a notice of compliance with conditions. And that's where you have a medication that has basically the safety issues all been dealt with. So there's no outstanding safety issues, and it has promising evidence effectiveness, but potentially may not have all the studies, especially for the longer term data, completed. And that has a time frame of 200 days. And then that authorization has attached to it conditions that are to be fulfilled, but the medication can be sold in Canada. This is just a little bit of a schematic of the submission process review. We really encourage companies to come in for pre-submission meetings, come in and sort of talk about the data, the clinical development process. In those cases, sometimes they do bring in experts with them, so healthcare professionals, patient representatives, to sort of talk about the data package and whether or not there are any special considerations that need to be taken into account during the review. And when I was leading one of the groups that was doing the authorizations, I used to tell the companies, tell us what's keeping you up at night now, because if you're talking about giving us a submission, it means there were things that you probably dealt with, that probably were potentially hiccups in the path, but you dealt with them, and then because you dealt with them, now you feel comfortable filing with us. So what are those? Because whatever kept you up late at night in the development of the product is going to be keeping us up at night as we do the reviews. So we really encourage them to have a good open dialogue, and that will help them as they put together the submission, and as well through after that filing process and that screening process and through the review process. It really helps us to know those things ahead of time. We use all of these meetings to also allocate resources within the different groups. We have review teams, and so we can stage it and know when things are coming in, so there aren't no delays when they get picked up. I've gone us through this a little bit, but really the pre-submission meetings are the ones that I've talked about. There's a formal application process for that priority review. A company has to request it. And they basically say that, they have a medication for which it's either going into a space where there are no other medications available for treatment, or that their submission is for a treatment that shows significant benefits above the ones that are already on the market. So either on the safety side, has a better safety profile, significantly better safety profile, or it's got a much better efficacy profile, effectiveness profile, and they can make that argument to say that this is why it needs a priority review. When the submissions come in, they all come in electronically now, and they are loaded into our electronic systems, and they make sure that it goes through a screening process. So make sure that all the components are there. There's not big chunks of information that may be missing that might delay or potentially even halt the submission. So you want to make sure that all of that's there before the reviewers even start on their assessments. And then you have the review. And the review, as I said, is broken down into different components, but ultimately the decision is for this medication or this treatment, do the benefits outweigh the potential risks? I know that sounds overly simplistic, but really that's what it comes down to. And that's what the underpinning is in the regulations. The minister has to be satisfied that those requirements are met for safety, for efficacy, and for quality. And then we see that the benefits outweigh the risk. And then we make the decision. Products are issued a notice of compliance, which is basically a notification that this product is in compliance with the regulations, and they get drug information, a number, and then they can be sold in Canada, which seems like it's a gateway to all of access to all for healthcare practitioners and patients. But as we all know, there's the other steps around pricing and reimbursement that have to be sorted out as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about openness and transparency. And I've been working in Health Canada since 2002, and it is phenomenal the difference in terms of how much information we are making available now compared to where I started. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that back, 2000 and before, Health Canada really was a black box. It was the sort of feeling of like, well, here are the regulations, we get submissions, off they go into this organization, and at the end of a year later, you find out if something gets authorized. And there wasn't a lot of transparency beyond that. But we made a lot of strides in terms of the notice of clients database that shows you which ones have been authorized. We have summaries that are done that are at high level, that are usually just a few pages that explains the review, all the data that went into the review decision. There's more detailed summary basis of decisions that are more technical documents that go into a bit more detail into the data. And we've also made great strides in something called public release clinical information. And this came about from researchers who said, that's fine that Health Canada's made a decision. We see the summaries, we know the summaries of studies, especially if they were published, but we want the data and we want to be able to look at it. We want to be able to reanalyze it. We want to be able to do our own research on it. And that was always a challenging part to deal with because of the confidential nature of data that goes into the development of medications. But we now said that once you have that authorization, that information should not be considered confidential business information, and we should be able to release it. And of course, we have to redact it for any privacy information, any patient information, but we're now releasing hundreds of thousands and millions of pages of information so that researchers can access that and do their own assessments. We have summary safety reviews, and these are reviews that, when the product is available on the market, if an issue comes up, we call a signal. So any indication that there might be an issue with the medication, we do an assessment, and then we summarize that assessment in a summary safety review, and we put that up on the web. And again, that's in lay language. It's only usually a few pages, but it talks about the trigger for what the issue was, what the assessment was, and then what the conclusions are, what we're doing in terms of follow-up at Health Canada. We have the Drug and Health Product Register available online, as well as the Drug Products Database, and that contains, and it's a searchable database, it contains information around all the approved medications, the product monographs that detail the information about how those products are used and what they're indicated for, the safety information, and provides people access online to all of that information. So what happens once we've done the authorization? As I said, it doesn't just end there. It's only the beginning. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea of how many different players there are with respect to pharmaceuticals. So all the way from the companies that do the development to, our role at Health Canada, to researchers that are doing research on both the pre-market side and the post-market side, organizations that do the assessment of cost effectiveness, obviously the healthcare system in terms of the people who are doing prescribing and dispensing and treating patients. So, and of course, most importantly, the patients that are at the center and the families that are at the center of all of this. And that's what we're all working towards, is to make sure that at the end of the day, that people have the medications that they need, and that they can have trust and faith in the system, that the authorization to know that those benefits and risks have been looked at and have been balanced. I won't get into this as much because I've sort of touched on it, but it's a little bit of a graphic representation in terms of the prescription continuum. And just to say that this is a long and risky, complex process. So natural sciences and natural science development and clinical trials, drug development can take years. I feel a little bit strange saying that just because we're just on the cusp of having authorized a first vaccine. That's just shown us if there is a will and a way and dedicated resources, international collaboration, just how quickly something can be developed. But this is more of the traditional timelines for drug development, from the preclinical through the regulatory review, through the health technology assessment, and then the reimbursement decisions. So what does that mean for Health Canada? It means that we need to continue to make sure that we're a modern organization. So granted, we're in, we have laws, we have regulations, and certainly to a great extent, the regulator is supposed to be very consistent. So a consistent, predictable pathway so that all the other players in the system kind of know how to behave to make sure that medications have a pathway through the system. But it also means that we need to be modern, we need to be an agile regulator, and we need to be able to respond to, most importantly, the needs of the healthcare system and the patients that are in them. So what are we doing? We are working, we've already done modernization of a few initiatives over the years to modernize our Food and Drugs Act and regulations. And we're doing more and more to make sure that we're integrated into the healthcare system. So I think a long time ago, it was separate organizations. Everyone had their mandate. This is my roles and responsibilities. I'm staying within that. And then all the rest of the system is doing all of that. But we weren't necessarily integrating in a way that I think was best for the patients, because, it's the sequence of things that have to happen. The question is, there are lag times, there are downtimes in that pathway. Are there ways to get rid of some of those downtimes, to find more efficiencies, to do things in parallel rather than one thing after another, and making sure that we have a way to prioritize the review. It's not just a first in, first out kind of thing, or all comers. It's, what are the actual needs of the healthcare system, and how do we do, how do we structure the overall system to be able to incentivize those products coming to market? So really, when we're talking about modernization, we're talking about three kind of pillars. One is access. So that's like having the agility to be able to have the flexibility to customize our approach to the needs of the product, and of course for the people that need them. Appropriate use. So, at the level of the national, the federal government, we have a certain leader, and then the medications go out into the healthcare system or out into the real world, as we say. But how do we support that and also have information going both ways, two ways through those systems to be able to make sure that these medications are used in the appropriate way? And then, of course, affordability. And I won't get into as much, I know, because Bill will be talking about that as well, but really that we're part of that system, and we can have all of the other measures in place, but if there's an issue around the last step in the access continuum, it means that, even if everything else is functioning, that people may not be getting the medication that they need. So here are just sort of overall the pillars. We've got a lot of collaboration across the health technology assessment groups, early reviews and parallel scientific advice through working with other organizations, using other foreign decisions to help find efficiencies in our review process, and working with other regulators to potentially work share. So we have a relationship with other organizations where we can actually divide up submissions, and we'll say, you'll do that section, we'll do this section, and we'll come together and then just make a final decision. Of course, we always have to make our own decisions for Canadians, but to find efficiencies in the process. Of course, more timely access. We have more pathways that we can go through, improving access to various different categories, access to more innovative medications, working on our pre-submission pieces, and of course, our special access program. And then in the post-market space, enhanced use of real-world evidence and making sure that we can have that feedback loop and make that most efficient as possible. So I've got, Kim, a few other slides in terms of the collaboration, but I think, I touched on it at a high level. So I'm going to go through all of these and I'm going to skip to the questions. But one of the things that I wanted to share with people before we kind of head into the questions is that I know, we're all anxiously awaiting, and we've had a lot of meetings on Trikafta as a medication that there was a lot of anticipation around. And, when I met with Kim and others, I told them that I remember exactly where I was when I saw that the US FDA had authorized Trikafta. I was actually in a meeting in Rome. The notification came across my screen, and as soon as I saw it, I was actually sitting beside the person who runs the organization that does the authorizations for that group, and I told him, I said, okay, what's going on? Have we talked to the company? What is the plan? Because it was just authorized, and there's going to be a lot of questions because we knew that there was so much anticipation around this medication. There had been so many testimonials and reports from people in the clinical trials that had really had profound effect on their own disease, and they had seen really good outcomes. And we know that we've had obviously a history for some of the second generation products that wasn't optimal in terms of patient access in Canada. So we knew immediately that this was going to be an issue. And then subsequent to that, I think there have been a lot of discussions about when the company was going to file and if they were going to file because of some of the other initiatives around pricing that were going on. And then a few weeks ago, I think everyone was quite happy to hear that it had been granted priority review by Health Canada. So the company has said that they will come in with the submission, and it was they made the request, as we said, to be granted priority review, and was accepted. And although this is not public knowledge yet, I wanted to let people know that on December 4th, we received the Trikafta submission. So it is in screening. The reason that it's not public knowledge as yet is because it only goes up onto our submission and review list when it gets accepted in that review. So it's still in that first phase, but I know it's eagerly anticipated by the whole community. So I wanted to make sure that we could share that bit of good news with you. And certainly we've made the commitment to, once it goes into review, look at the submission as quickly as possible. And I know the company as well is committed to having a smooth pathway through the reviews. So I'm going to end there, Kim, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Supriya. And I think just because some of the questions we've received, I think will be dealt in Bill and Joanne's presentation. So we're going to move quickly to them, and then I'll come back to the questions that we have received in advance that have not been addressed in any of the presentations, and then move on to the live questions. Thanks. Over to you, Joanne and Bill.
Hi, thanks so much. And Supriya, it's great to be working across from you on an issue. It's been way too long. And, you mentioned about the approval of a vaccine earlier this week. I feel like I've seen a lot of you lately because you're often on the news, and you did a great job communicating this week. It was with humility, but, giving a real pat on the back to your colleagues and yourself at Health Canada for really pulling up all the stops to get that vaccine. That was a really emotional, amazing moment for all Canadians. Way to go. the one thing I'll take from your presentation was that where there's a will and a way and dedicated resources, a lot of stuff can happen and move. And I think that that's really important for everyone working on this product in the community and within all of the different review steps that we're going to talk through. I don't think you're going to find a community that has more of a will. So, you know, thanks very much again, and let's get at it. And we're looking forward to more questions later. But I should say, before I get started, thank you, Kim, for inviting Joanne and I and 360 to help walk people through this. We do work with the manufacturer of Trikafta for a while now, and it's given us a ringside seat on some of the bumps and obstacles and other challenges on gene modulators. So hopefully that will help, but I did have to make that disclosure before we get started. We're going to walk through patient access to new medicines. Of course, Supriya's done a great job of explaining Health Canada. There's a lot more after Health Canada. In fact, although this infographic that we developed a couple of years ago can look intimidating, as well as the other flow charts and the spaghetti flow chart that Supriya and Health Canada showed earlier, we tried to break it down through the public side. As you'll see on the left side is the infographic that has different stages of review and funding decisions and negotiations. And then on the private side, they get an escalator. About 26 million Canadians rely on private plans to get access to their medicines. It's generally a lot faster, about 150 days on average if you look over the past 10 years. And it takes closer to 450 days to make your way down the public staircase. We'll talk briefly about each one of these stages, but I will say that some of them can overlap. And I think that that's one of the challenges that Kim asked us to look at today. You know, how can health technology assessments start, that review start even before Health Canada has provided its notice of compliance or its authorization. We know that there are negotiations for some gene modulators happening at the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance right now. So how can we make sure that those happen in the shortest possible time? How can we make sure that the public formularies and hospitals list it right away? And I know Kim and CF Canada and the community have a letter from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador that says that they will list it as soon as they have that negotiated letter of intent from the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So you're already doing great work punching some of these things. We'll walk through, and at each stage we're going to talk briefly about what you can do a little bit more. We won't talk about this because Supriya's already done it. I just want to know when Special Access Program will drop the ME at the end. It should be called the Ye Old Special Access Program, and then it will be modernized. But there may be actually some questions about SAP a little bit later too. The Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, this is the primary federal agency, as many of you know, because you've been very active and at the forefront of a lot of the advocacy around this issue. It's the federal quasi-judicial agency. It regulates and ensures that prices are not excessive, and it also does reports and analysis. And this is just a few weeks away from coming into effect. There's a new list of comparator countries that Canada will be compared to, and a number of new factors that will come into an evaluation of the acceptable, non-excessive price allowed in Canada. And once again, just to say, you know, you've been there right from the beginning on this one. I will say, you know, the shoe has not completely dropped on the PMPRB. They will come into, you know, this process not as a separate stage, and that's why we have them as a reviewer. But the first sale of Trikafta will have to be reported, and all of the sales will have to be reported to the federal PMPRB. And we don't know how that review is going to go, if an investigation could be started, et cetera. So we'll see. Continued advocacy may be required on this front, depending on what happens in January with the new list and how the new economic factors will come into effect. The next stage, and this is probably the most important if you're looking out at the next, you know, 4, 5, 6 weeks of what the cystic fibrosis community can do. Health technology assessment. So where Health Canada is looking at clinical efficacy, safety, and quality of a medicine, generally compared to placebo or standard of care, CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, It operates in all provinces except for Quebec. It makes non-binding reimbursement recommendations to all of the public drug plans, including those of the federal government. And what it does is it looks at comparative clinical and cost effectiveness of medicines. They've had a patient input opportunity since about 2010. I believe that the Common Drug Review, and that's where this would actually make its way through. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about. I did want to say, as you imagine that those stairwells, it's not a straight path. And as many of you who've worked on Kalydeco or Cambie know, it's certainly not a straight path. Health Canada will provide an indication, or say that this patient population, the benefits outweigh the risks, and therefore should be authorized for sale in Canada for that population. What happens often at CADTH is that population gets narrowed because they say, you know what, it's most cost effective here, or most clinically effective here. And I think that's where the patient and clinician input opportunity can really make a difference. The manufacturer, of course, is going to be putting forward the population that they want to see reimbursed by the public payers. However, CADTH and their equivalents in the provinces can actually try to narrow that. And that's really important, I think, for you to keep in mind. So where you can engage, there's a patient input opportunity that will start early in the new year, depending on when the manufacturer actually submits the CADTH. And again, they can submit to CADTH before the Health Canada finishes its review. So we talked to Kim and CF Canada before this, and there's going to be a survey going out to the community. There's a clinician input opportunity, and this is new for those going through the Common Drug Review. This has been around for a long time for oncologists and cancer, and there's a lot of experience that the clinician can build on. Look at how cancer has actually handled that, and remember that when this opportunity comes open. So where and how do patients and caregivers make a difference in terms of providing their experience? And you know, your role is to educate the expert reviewers and the team at the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies and Health that are going to be putting a package together for the pharmacists, the ethicists, the physicians and others, the health economists, who are sitting around the table and making this decision about reimburse, do not reimburse this medicine. And your role is to explain the impact of CF, the physical and emotional and social impact of it. What's your experience with currently available therapies, and where are the gaps there? And what is your experience with or expectations for the medicine under review? And honestly, CF Canada has done a fantastic job of transferring that knowledge and that experience. And you want to help those reviewers and those recommendation makers get into the shoes of your kids and your CF moms and your everyone around, you know, the clinicians and all of that. The impacts consider impact on caregivers, productivity, quality of life issues, like fewer hospital visits, ability to work, take part in other activities, fewer visits to the physio, et cetera. And clinicians have a unique experience and expertise to bring as well. So they can provide input on the value of a particular drug and where it actually fits in terms of their practice. And I have to say, for the cystic fibrosis community, often it's not just, as you know, a prescribing clinician that you're dealing with. Often you have a huge health team, you have physiotherapists and others. So just think about how the teams and the groups of clinical experts around CF can get together, because it is strongly encouraged for a group to work together to bring that forward, and I'm sure that's going to happen. They can provide insight into areas of unmet need from a practice setting perspective. So, you know, that's it for my part. I'm going to pass over to Joe and maybe come back later for some questions. Joe?
Thanks, Bill. So this slide here illustrates the patient input opportunity, clinician and patient input opportunity process. So as you can see, the process starts with CADTH, who will issue a call for input, and then stakeholders will have 35 business days in which to prepare their input on the new medicine. And so as Bill mentioned, we know that CF Canada is preparing and planning to circulate a survey in January to seek input from patients, from caregivers, and that input will really help them develop their submission that they'll present to CADTH. Bill also mentioned that clinicians can now provide input. And so CADTH really encourages clinicians to work as a group that represents them. That group doesn't have to be formal. It can be any type of group. It can be a medical or scientific advisory board of a patient group. It can be a CF clinic. As long as you're a group, they want to see what the perspectives are of many clinicians. And so once that happens, after that, CADTH conducts its reviews, and the expert committee will issue its draft recommendation. And there, stakeholders have a second opportunity to provide input. So those who provided input initially on the medicine can provide input on the draft recommendation. And this is a very important step because we've seen instances where the recommendation completely changed based on the input of clinicians and patients. So where there was a negative recommendation, and then stakeholders inputted on it and it changed it. At the end, they issued a positive final recommendation. So it's a very important step to the process, and that takes about 10 business days.
Oh, sorry.
Once that's over, CADTH will issue its final recommendation, and it can issue either decide a recommendation to reimburse with conditions, or do not reimburse. And as Bill mentioned, this is an very important recommendation because it will help inform the pricing negotiations that happen, as well as public drug plans' decision as to whether or not to reimburse the drug and based on which criteria to reimburse the drug. So a restrictive criteria or broad criteria. And that's where we really want the broadest possible criteria aligned with the indication of Health Canada so that as many patients that could benefit from the drug can access the drug. Next step is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance negotiations, or what we call the PCPA negotiations. So the PCPA includes all provinces, the territories, as well as the federal government. And its role, it's responsible for negotiating the reimbursement terms with the manufacturer, and that includes the price of the medicine. In practice, what will happen is that one government will take the lead and negotiate with the manufacturer on behalf of all of the other governments that have decided to take part in the negotiations. If it's successful, if we do get a deal at the PCPA, then the manufacturer will have to go to each of the different governments and complete a product listing agreement. That process, compared to CADTH, where CADTH usually takes around 6 to 7 months to complete, this is where here at the PCPA, it's a little tricky because there's no set timeline. It can take from several weeks to several months, and it varies a lot depending on the medicine. We've seen negotiations go by very quickly where there was a deal a few weeks after CADTH issued its recommendations, and we've seen other that took a long time. It took several months. So it's really an important step, and I think it leads well into what can be done, what can patients and clinicians do here at this step of the process. And it's really to ensure that the negotiations on the CF medicines get prioritized. We know that PCPA is currently negotiating Orkambi and Kalydeco, so continuing to call for those negotiations to be completed rapidly, and also for Trikafta to be added to this, so that as soon as CADTH issues its recommendation on Trikafta, it can get reimbursed really quickly by the provincial plans, the provincial drug plans. And we're recommending here that you really focus on your provincial representatives, so the Premier, the Health Minister, as well as your local parliamentarians as well. So once you have a PCPA deal, as mentioned, the manufacturer will then go to each of the governments and conclude what we call a product listing agreement. And that will ensure that the drug can get added to the various formularies and ultimately be made available to patients. And that's a step as well that really varies from one province to another. Some provinces have additional health technology assessment reviews, like for example, Alberta and British Columbia. So that step can vary. The listing process after the PCPA deal can really vary. We've seen, for example, some of the provinces like Ontario and Quebec typically list quite quickly after a deal, whereas certain of the Atlantic provinces and increasingly Alberta can take a bit longer. So it really varies. So it's important, and that leads into what you can do at this step is really to make sure that the drug, the listing of the drug is prioritized once there's a PCPA deal. And we've seen, for example, that Newfoundland, and Bill mentioned it, has committed in writing in a letter to list the medicine as soon as there's a PCPA deal. So really trying to get that same commitment in writing from other provinces is would be the objective here, because we really want that step to go quickly. And again, as we've recommended previously, the focus here is really on your provincial representatives, so the Premier, Health Minister, and your local parliamentarians. So to sum it up, we'll just get the list here. What can patients and clinicians and caregivers do to try to expedite and accelerate the access to the CF gene modulator and Trikafta? First of all, is to really get engaged and participate as much as you can in the CADTH consultations. So of course, respond to the survey that will be circulated by CF Canada. Encourage clinicians as well, your team, your professional health professionals that you deal with, to take part in the consultations. Second, continue to keep the noise high around the PCPA negotiations, especially at the provincial level, really to ensure that these get completed as quickly as possible. Third, try to secure provincial support. So as we've mentioned, try to get commitment in writing that the provinces will list quickly after a PCPA deal. Fourth, be prepared to engage on any obstacle or delays as they may arise at any step of the process that we've listed. And finally, continue to leverage basically every forum or every opportunity you have to really prioritize the reimbursement of CF medicine. So it could be political town halls, your virtual meetings with your parliamentarians, just to keep the noise up, to make sure that that happens in parallel as the drug gets reviewed by CADTH and gets negotiated at PCPA.
And that's it for us. Kim, over to you to direct traffic.
Great, thanks guys, and thanks Dr. Sharma. This is very, very informative. We have received a few questions. The first one I think I'm going to kind of combine and put to you, Dr. Sharma. It's a question around what happens to the medicine that people receive, Trikafta, through the special access program, if and when Trikafta becomes available in Canada.
Yeah, so first, just the other piece of news I think on the special access program is that the company is also expanding the age, so moving to a lower age limit as well for access through the special access program. And I can tell that Bill did not go to the Health Canada website recently, because if he did, he will understand that the ME has been removed from the special access program. So that we even modernized that. So what happens with the special access program is that one of the requirements through that is that a product is not authorized, so it doesn't have a notice of compliance. So when we're going through the review, I mean, and it's not authorized yet, there's a process by which, as we're getting closer to review, it looks like the product would be authorized. There's a gradual sort of weaning off the special access program. So people might see then we do lower amounts. So with the authorization maybe for 3 months or 1 month as we get closer. But the company comes in and puts together a transition program, because we don't want people that are on the medication to then have a gap as they move to that authorization process. Now, normally what would happen is that from the time you get the notice of compliance to when you're going to market launch, it's usually about, it can be, it can be as short as 1 month, but it's often around 3 months. What we're finding now, though, is if you have companies that are in prolonged discussions around funding and reimbursement, that can go longer and longer. So then that sort of puts the special access program in a difficult place where you have a product that's been authorized, so technically should not be eligible for the special access program, but it's not really available to people because it hasn't been reimbursed. So we've been making special dispensation for that period to allow for that transition. So, it is getting more complicated, I think, with some of the higher price medications and some of those transitions, but that's what we do. We try to figure out a way to ease people from the special access program into the more regular access ones.
There we go. I'm on mute. Everybody gets the t-shirt this year. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Bill and Joanne, I wanted to put this next one to you, which is, how does the CADTH patient input work, and can individual patients submit?
So CADTH really encourages patients to come together under the auspices of a patient group to provide their input. So it's really a group input approach that's, I'd say, prioritized at CADTH. So it's really the patient group input. Only in certain cases where there's no patient group, if it's a very rare, ultra rare condition, that CADTH will authorize on a case-by-case basis individual submission. But if not, the standard approach is through patient groups and clinician group input as well. They're encouraging clinicians to work together. And that's because they say they want to have an idea, a bit of the consensus of the clinical community. It doesn't have to be an established clinician group per se. It can be a professional group, but it can also be, as I've mentioned, medical or scientific advisory committee of a patient group, or another loosely based clinician association or group.
Thanks,
it's a bit different
Joanne.
from Quebec. Quebec allows individual submissions. Yeah. We should mention that.
Yeah, Quebec is a bit more, I'd say, flexible in the sense that they'll accept patient group submissions, but as well individual patients, individual caregivers can provide their input through special questionnaires that's made available to them. And clinicians as well in Quebec, and even citizens, anybody can actually provide their input as part of the INESS opportunity.
Thank you. And we did get a question from somebody asking particularly about whether or not CF clinicians know that they can contribute. This is it's a newer process, and we are working to let the clinicians know that they have an opportunity to weigh in here. As you know, the clinicians have really provided tremendous support around Trikafta, and we certainly want to point to every opportunity possible for them to engage. I will ask another question to you, Dr. Sharma, and that is, you mentioned in the SAP and that it would be expanding to lower ages. So I'm assuming it's 6 to 11, potentially that's where the clinical trials have been. What is the process for making that extension at Health Canada?
So I'm just checking because I had it written. I just checked before I came. Yep, so it's six and older. And it's exactly the same process as with the others, the special access program requests. So it would just be that they, a notification the company would consider a broader age range in terms of the requests, but the actual assessment at the special access program doesn't change. Okay,
great. Bill and Joanne, I'm going to give this to you because I think this describes perfectly the challenges of the Canadian reimbursement landscape. This individual says, if I have First Nations coverage and third-party coverage through Great West Life, will I be able to get the drug as soon as possible? And the drug being as soon as it is approved. Sorry, as soon as it is approved.
That's a great case study for a couple of reasons, Kim. First of all, if they're covered under the non-insured health benefits program, used to be of Health Canada, now it's Indigenous Services Canada. They are part of the PCPA, so generally they would wait until a lot of those steps have been walked through before they could access it. Now, if you're have access to a private benefit plan that is relatively open and insured, or a big employer can actually spread the risk of being able to invest in a drug coverage for thousands of employees, for example, and even the smaller insurers can actually pool that risk. There are a couple of different insurance mechanisms. Then that should be a lot faster. The private payers have been putting in more prior authorization requirements, as well as a couple of them have been, making noise about waiting for CADTH's recommendations before they make a decision. But I should also say a lot of the private payers are ramping up on negotiation opportunities they have teams that are on their own. So, you know, we might have to change our infographic just a little bit to add some negotiations on the private side, but it should be a lot faster for somebody who has coverage through one of the major payers, and Great-West Life certainly is one of those.
Thanks, Bill. And this will be the final question for the evening. We have a few others. We will respond to those in writing and put them in our blog and let everybody know how to find them. But Dr. Sharma, I'm going to put this to you. It's one that we receive often, and it is there anything stopping Trikafta from being approved as fast as COVID vaccines have, considering other regulators and patients have had it for so long already?
So, I mean, I think as Bill alluded to as well, this was, you know, it's when you have a lot of resources and concentrated effort on a specific product that you can actually move it through very quickly. Now, the vaccines are a little bit special in that it's coming through what we call an interim order pathway. So that is something that was specifically, it's one of the quickest regulatory tools that we have, but a specific pathway that was put in response to a public health emergency. And the last time we did that sort of a similar pathway was during H1N1. That gave us a lot of flexibilities on the regulatory side of things to do things like a rolling review, so we can get some data, and then we can get the data as the clinical trials are being developed. It allows us to put what we call terms and conditions on the license. So, and there's a series of other things that it allows us to do. So I don't think we'll be getting it to a point where it's that short. But one of the things that we've been looking at is, you know, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned coming through this COVID-19 process. We already have the modernization initiative that's underway. We have a whole advanced therapeutics initiative, right, in terms of trying to find more efficient pathways for new technologies. We have, as you know, some of the ones that I've mentioned around use of foreign reviews and using that to expedite the reviews. So there are mechanisms to find efficiencies in the review process and not have it have to take the full length of time, and to shorten that down. And so I think one thing is taking the lessons learned, seeing what we can actually carry over into the normal state whenever we get back to normal. But also in the background, there were things that were already in the works. So, I mean, I think if there is a product like Trikafta that has, you know, if there's a good evidence base, if it has been authorized fairly recently in another jurisdiction, that will help the process. We still have to go through, obviously, the data in the Canadian context and make sure that it's meeting our requirements and our regulations and is appropriate for the population. And then it's always the negotiations around, you know, the indications and the label and all of that happens. And, you know, we always, I think there's a lot of discussions about harmonizing Canadian decisions to other jurisdictions, but there's also situations where, you know, the US will do one thing in terms of the authorization, the European Medicines Agency does something else, and we're looking at the same data sets, and we have to kind of make those decisions as well. So just to say, I think the bottom line is every effort to find those flexibilities and those innovations in the regulatory review system. And we absolutely know that the community is really anxious to have this go through the review process as quickly as possible while still maintaining, obviously, our role.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Sharma, and thanks, Bill and Joanne. This will bring tonight's program to a close. We really appreciate you sharing your thoughtful insights with us and for helping our community better understand Canada's drug system and the different pathways that Trikafta and other CF modulators may take toward access. I also want to say a good thank you to all of you who have participated so actively in our recent Access to Modulators webinars. As I mentioned earlier, recordings of past webinars, all of the past webinars can be found on our website. We will be back in the new year with more of this series, including a session on private insurance, as well as other series that may be of interest to you. Please continue to check out our website, our Facebook page, and other social media channels to get the latest information on access to Trikafta and other disease modulators. We thank our generous donors who make Cystic Fibrosis Canada's work possible, and we thank all of you for all of the good work that you do to improve access to CF medicines. We wish you and yours all the best for the holiday season. Good night.